Its flawlessness was the first warning sign. Welcome to Sherlock File. I am your host, Julian Whitmore. Share your location in the comments. I enjoy reading them all. Grateful you're here. Let's begin. The drive to Blackfriars Square was accomplished in near silence, for Holmes had drawn himself into that inward state of abstraction which I had learned to respect as the prelude to his most delicate reasoning. The fog lay thick upon the riverward streets, coiling in sluggish wreaths beneath the lamps and rendering each passer-by a dim and shifting silhouette. Our cab rattled over the stones with a muffled echo, and more than once we were forced to slow as carts loomed suddenly from the grey murk ahead. Holmes, seated opposite me, had drawn his hat low and his collar high, so that little of his face was visible. Yet I could see the restless play of his long fingers upon his knee. It was the only outward sign of the activity within. "You observed it?" he said abruptly, without raising his head. "The flaw in Pencombe's account." "The flaw in his perfection," Holmes corrected. "There is a distinction, Watson, and an important one. I confess I see little beyond what he himself indicated, that the evidence appears almost too conveniently arranged." "Precisely. And when a thing appears too convenient, we must ask for whom." I reflected upon this. For the police, perhaps. A simple burglary, a dead servant, a missing casket. It would satisfy the most cursory inquiry. Holmes gave a faint murmur of approval. "Very good, yet our client does not appear to seek simplicity. On the contrary, he resists it. That, surely, argues in his favour." "Does it?" Holmes's eyes flashed suddenly in the gloom. "Or does it suggest that he wishes us to resist it also? There are men, Watson, who lie clumsily and are detected at once. There are others who lie cleverly and escape suspicion, but the most dangerous of all is he who tells the truth, save in that single particular which it is most essential to conceal." Before I could pursue the matter further, the cab drew up with a jerk, and the driver's voice announced our arrival. We descended before a tall, sombre house whose darkened windows and shuttered aspect spoke eloquently of the tragedy within. A constable stood at the door, his cape beaded with moisture, and admitted us at once upon learning Holmes's name. The interior was lit but dimly, as though the household shrank from too great an illumination. In the hall stood Inspector Lestrade, his sharp, ferret-like features set in an expression of professional gravity, which relaxed slightly at the sight of my companion. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I had word you might be coming. A nasty business, this." "So I gather," Holmes replied coolly. "You have preserved the scene?" "As far as may be. I have had no one enter the study since my examination this morning." "Excellent. Then we shall begin there." Lestrade led the way down a short passage, at the end of which a door stood ajar. He pushed it open, and we entered. The room into which we stepped was of moderate size, but furnished with a richness which spoke of old family comfort rather than ostentation. A heavy escritoire stood near the window, its drawers pulled wide and papers disordered upon the floor. A Persian rug lay before the hearth, and upon it, covered now by a sheet, was the outline of the dead man. Holmes crossed the room without a word and knelt beside the body. With a deft movement he drew back the covering. I turned my eyes away for an instant, for the wound at the throat was both sudden and severe. Yet Holmes regarded it with the calm scrutiny of a surgeon. "Clean," he murmured, "very clean. A narrow blade, as we were told. No sign of struggle." "He was struck from behind, most likely," said Lestrade. "Never knew what hit him." "Perhaps," Holmes returned. "Or perhaps he knew very well." He rose and moved to the window. It stood slightly open, and the sill bore dark smears of mud. Holmes bent low, examining them with his lens. "You have observed these, of course?" said Lestrade. "I have observed them," said Holmes. "Whether I have yet seen them is another matter." Lestrade sniffed, but held his peace. Holmes passed next to the escritoire. He touched the forced drawer lightly, then examined the scattered papers without disturbing their arrangement. A faint smile touched his lips, though he said nothing. "Nothing of importance taken save the casket?" he asked. "Nothing," said Lestrade. "We have checked the silver and the plate, all in place." "And the footprints outside?" "In the garden. Come and see." We followed him through the window and into the small enclosed space beyond. The fog hung even heavier here, pressed down by the surrounding walls. Upon the damp earth beneath the sill were indeed several impressions of boots, irregular but distinct. "A man of fair size," said Lestrade, "heavy tread, came in by the wall, crossed here, and out again the same way. There are marks on the bricks where he climbed." Holmes stood motionless, his gaze fixed upon the ground. Then he turned slowly back toward the house. "Curious," said he. "What is curious?" demanded Lestrade. "That our burglar, having risked his neck to scale a wall, should trouble himself to leave such obliging traces of his passage." Lestrade coloured slightly. "You think they were made after?" "I think nothing as yet. I observe only that they are very, how shall I say it, considerate." We returned to the study where Holmes resumed his silent circuit. He paused once more beside the body, then at the hearth where a faint trace of ash lay scattered beyond the grate. "Has anything been burned here?" he asked. "Some papers, perhaps," said Lestrade. We found charred fragments. Holmes stooped and picked up a minute scrap between finger and thumb. He held it to the light, then slipped it into his pocket without comment. At that moment there came a soft movement at the door, and a young lady entered, pale and composed, yet with eyes that bore the unmistakable shadow of recent distress. She was dressed in black, though with a simplicity that suggested habit rather than mourning. "Mr. Holmes," said she. He bowed. "Miss Elwood, I presume." She inclined her head. "My mistress desires to know whether you have any need of her at present. She is most anxious to assist, though her strength is not what it was." "I shall have that honour presently," said Holmes gently. "For the moment, perhaps you can inform me. Did the deceased, Hatherley, have any habit of remaining in this room late at night?" "None that I am aware of," she replied. "He would see to the doors and retire by 10. "And last night?" "I cannot say. I heard nothing until Miss Vane called out." Holmes regarded her steadily for a moment, then dismissed her with a courteous word. When she had gone, he turned to us with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "The game is afoot," said he softly. "And I think, Watson, that our perfect lie has already begun to show its seams." Lestrade gave a short, impatient laugh, though I could see that Holmes's quiet certainty had not left him untouched. "You speak as though the whole affair were already clear to you," said he. "For my part, I see a dead man, a broken drawer, and a thief who left by the window. It is a plain case." Holmes clasped his hands behind his back and paced slowly across the room. "Plain cases are the most treacherous," he returned. "They present themselves so readily that one is tempted to accept them without examination. Tell me, Lestrade, did you find the key to this escritoire?" "In the lock." "And the drawer? Was it locked before it was forced?" "So Miss Vane says." "Indeed. And you have verified that the lock bears marks of violence?" Lestrade hesitated. "There are marks, certainly, enough to show it was prized open." Holmes bent once more to the drawer and examined the edge with minute care. "Yes," said he at last. "There are marks, but I confess I should like to see the instrument which made them. It would be a tool of a most accommodating character." Lestrade frowned. "What do you mean by that?" Holmes straightened himself. "Only that the scratches are distributed with remarkable neatness, as though the operator had been more concerned with producing an effect than with gaining entry, but we shall not anticipate. There are other matters which interest me more." He crossed to the bell-pull and gave it a slight tug. After a moment, the footman entered, a pale young fellow whose uneasiness was apparent in every line of his figure. "You will be good enough," said Holmes, "to inform Miss Vane that I should be glad of a few minutes' conversation if she feels equal to it." The servant bowed and withdrew. Holmes turned at once to Lestrade. "You have questioned the household?" "Every one of them." "And with what result?" "Nothing out of the common. The cook heard nothing." "The maids were asleep in the upper floor." "This young woman, Miss Elwood, appears steady enough. As for Mr. Pencombe, he was in his rooms until the alarm was raised." Holmes nodded absently. "And the dismissed secretary, this Mr. Kett, have you traced him?" "We have made inquiries." "He left London, so far as we can learn." "Ah." The single syllable seemed to carry more meaning than a page of commentary. Before Lestrade could press him further, the door opened again, and Miss Elwood reappeared, supporting an elderly lady whose frailty was evident at a glance. Miss Honoria Vane was tall but bowed, her thin hands trembling upon her companion's arm. Her face, though lined and worn, retained traces of a once commanding beauty, and her eyes, deeply set, had a keen and penetrating expression which suffering had not wholly dimmed. "Mr. Holmes," said she in a voice that strove for firmness, "you will excuse my weakness. This dreadful occurrence has shaken me more than I care to admit. Pray ask what you must." Holmes advanced and bowed with a courtesy that was almost tender. "I shall not detain you longer than necessary, madam. I understand that you were the first to discover the body." "I was." "You heard a noise?" "A crash, faint yet distinct. It roused me from sleep." "And you came down at once?" "I waited but to throw on a wrapper." "You found the study door open?" "Not wide open, ajar, as though not fully closed." "And the room? Was it as we now see it?" Miss Vane's brow contracted slightly. "So far as I can recall, yes. The drawers were open, the papers disturbed. The window, yes, the window was unlatched." Holmes inclined his head. "You are certain of that last point?" "I am." "And you observed nothing else? No shadow? No movement?" "Nothing. Only poor Hatherley." Her voice faltered, and Miss Elwood pressed her arm more closely. Holmes allowed a moment to pass. "This casket which has been taken, can you describe it?" "It was of lacquer, black with gold figures, Japanese work. It had belonged to my father." "And its contents?" "Miniatures of my parents, a ring set with a small sapphire, and a packet of letters tied with a blue ribbon." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Letters of importance?" Miss Vane hesitated. "Of a private nature. I would not wish them to be seen by strangers." "Understandably. Had any person, to your knowledge, shown interest in these papers?" "No one, save—" She paused again. "Pray continue." "Save Mr. Kett, my former secretary. He was impertinent enough to question me once regarding certain family matters. I dismissed him shortly thereafter." Holmes glanced at Lestrade, who gave a small, triumphant nod, as though this confirmed his own suspicions. "And Hatherley," Holmes continued, "had he any knowledge of the casket?" "Only that it existed. He had no concern with its contents." Holmes thanked her and motioned gently that she should be seated. Miss Elwood led her from the room, casting back one anxious glance before the door closed behind them. For some moments after their departure, Holmes remained silent. Then he turned abruptly to Lestrade. "You see how admirably the facts support your theory," said he. Lestrade drew himself up. "I do indeed." "And yet," Holmes went on softly, "there is not one of them which I would accept without question." He moved again to the hearth and stood looking down at the place where the body had lain. "Consider, Lestrade. A burglar enters by the garden, leaves his footprints obligingly beneath the window, forces a drawer with a tool which obligingly leaves marks, takes a single object of limited value, and departs, after silencing the only man who might have raised an alarm. It is a narrative complete in every detail." "Well?" said Lestrade. "Well," Holmes replied, "it is precisely because it is so complete that I mistrust it." He turned suddenly to me. Watson, you will observe that Miss Vane's account, though sincere, is curiously devoid of one element. And what is that? Surprise, said Holmes quietly. She describes the scene as one might describe a room already familiar. There is no note of confusion, no uncertainty. She remembers that the window was unlatched, yet she had but a moment to observe it, and in a state of agitation. You think she is mistaken? I think, said Holmes, that someone wishes us to believe she could not be mistaken. Lestrade gave an exclamation of impatience. Then what do you propose? Holmes's thin lips curved slightly. I propose, said he, that we inquire a little further into the habits of the dead man, the movements of the living, and, above all, the origin of this exceedingly perfect lie. Holmes's words seemed to hang in the air, leaving behind them a curious sense of incompleteness, as though the pieces of some intricate machine had been set in motion, though their purpose was not yet clear. Lestrade, who had listened with growing impatience, at last broke the silence with a decisive gesture. I shall continue my inquiries along practical lines, said he. This man Kett appears to me the most likely party. Dismissed from service, knowledge of the house, perhaps a grievance, he fits well enough. And therefore too well, murmured Holmes. Lestrade shrugged. We shall see. I have already sent men to trace him. In the meantime, I have the household under observation. Holmes inclined his head. An excellent precaution. Pray do not relax it. With that the inspector withdrew, leaving us alone once more in the dim study. Holmes stood for a few moments in thought, then turned briskly to me. Come, Watson, we shall learn more from the living than from the dead, for the present. He rang again, and the footman returned. You will show me, if you please, the room occupied by the late Mr. Hatherley. The man led us upstairs by a narrow back staircase, plainly intended for the servants' use. The air grew colder as we ascended, and the muffled quiet of the house seemed even more oppressive away from the main rooms. At last we reached a small chamber at the top, neatly kept, with a narrow bed, a wooden chest, and a washstand. Holmes entered at once and began his examination with the same swift, methodical precision I had so often admired. He opened the chest, inspected its contents, glanced over the few garments hanging upon a peg, and then turned his attention to the small table beside the bed. Orderly, said he, very orderly, a man of habit. There is little here of interest, I remarked. On the contrary, said Holmes, holding up a pair of gloves. Observe. I took them from him. They were of good leather, but worn at the fingertips. A butler's gloves, said I. Precisely. Yet note the staining upon the right forefinger. I looked more closely. There was indeed a faint discoloration, scarcely visible. Ink, I suggested. Not ink. A chemical stain, possibly from handling some preparation. Yet Hatherley's duties would scarcely bring him into contact with such substances. Holmes replaced the gloves and moved to the washstand. There he examined the basin, the soap, and finally the towel, which he lifted and sniffed. Aha! What is it? A faint trace of metal. Iron, perhaps, recently washed, yet not wholly removed. You think he had blood upon his hands? It is possible. But whose blood? He straightened and looked about him once more, his gaze lingering upon the chest. With a sudden movement he knelt and drew it forward, revealing a narrow space between it and the wall. From this he extracted a small, folded paper. "What have you found?" I asked eagerly. Holmes unfolded it with care. It proved to be a torn fragment of a letter, the writing hurried and uneven. "Only part of it remains," said he. "Listen, must be done tonight. Delay is impossible. The lady suspects nothing but the other." "The other?" I repeated. "The sentence breaks there. The remainder is missing." "This is important." "Highly so," said Holmes, slipping the fragment into his pocket. "It suggests that Hatherley was not merely a passive victim, but had knowledge, perhaps even participation, in some design." You mean he was involved in the crime? I mean that he may have been involved in something, Holmes corrected. Whether that something was the crime itself or another matter entirely remains to be seen. We left the room and descended once more. As we reached the lower passage, Holmes paused suddenly and turned toward a side door. "What lies here?" he asked. "The pantry, sir," said the footman. Holmes entered without hesitation. The room was small and lined with shelves upon which were arranged bottles, glasses, and various household articles. Holmes moved swiftly among them, examining labels and contents with keen attention. At last he stopped before a narrow shelf upon which stood several small bottles. "Chloral," said he, taking one up. "And recently disturbed." "That was for Miss Vane," I remarked. "Mr. Pencombe told us so." "Indeed. And yet, observe, the stopper is not properly replaced, and there is a slight residue upon the neck." "More has been poured than was necessary for a single dose." "You think—" "I think nothing," said Holmes. "But I note everything." He replaced the bottle and turned away. "Now, Watson, we shall have a word with Mr. Pencombe himself." We found our client in a small sitting room, pacing restlessly before the fire. He looked up sharply as we entered, and I could not but remark the pallor of his face and the strained expression of his features. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he asked, "have you discovered anything?" Holmes regarded him steadily. "I have discovered," said he, "that your household is a most interesting one." Pencombe forced his smile. "I cannot say I share your view." "No? Yet we have a butler who receives mysterious letters, a mistress who recalls events with singular precision under distress, and a companion whose composure is most admirable. It is a combination which invites inquiry." Pencombe's expression hardened slightly. "You speak in riddles, Mr. Holmes." "Do I? Then let me be more direct. You told us everything save one thing." A flicker of alarm crossed the man's face. "I do not understand you." Holmes stepped closer, his eyes fixed upon him with an intensity that was almost oppressive. "You told us," said he softly, "what occurred last night, but you did not tell us what led up to it." For a moment, Pencombe stood quite still, as though Holmes's words had struck him with physical force. Then he gave a short, strained laugh, which failed entirely to conceal his agitation. "I assure you, Mr. Holmes," said he, "there is nothing of consequence which I have withheld." Holmes did not at once reply. He had taken up a position by the mantelpiece where the light fell clearly upon Pencombe's face. His own expression was one of mild interest, yet there was in his gaze that penetrating quality which I had seen reduce stronger men than our client to confusion. "Nothing of consequence," he repeated softly. "And yet you paused twice when speaking of your former secretary. You hesitated again when Miss Vane mentioned the letters. And you visited a church this morning, though you are not, I think, a man of habitual devotion." Pencombe's fingers tightened upon the back of a chair. "You build much upon very little." "On the contrary," said Holmes, "I build upon the only foundation which never fails, human inconsistency. Pray be seated. You will find it easier to speak." The man hesitated, then obeyed. Holmes remained standing, his back to the fire, his long shadow stretching across the carpet. "Let us take the matter in order," he continued. "This Mr. Kett, you say he was dismissed for impertinence. What form did that impertinence take?" Pencombe moistened his lips. He presumed to question my aunt regarding certain private papers." "Which papers?" "The same, no doubt, which were contained in the casket." "Indeed, and how came he to know of them?" "I cannot say. Servants observe more than one supposes." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Quite so. And yet it is curious that a secretary, a man of education, should risk his position by such a question, unless he had reason to believe those papers of particular interest." "You suggest he had some design upon them?" "I suggest nothing. I merely observe that his conduct was not that of idle curiosity. Pencomb shifted uneasily. It is possible he had formed some extravagant notion. He was not, I think, entirely stable. "Ah," said Holmes, "that is convenient." The faint emphasis upon the last word caused Pencomb to flush. "You imply that I misrepresent him?" "I imply nothing which you have not yourself suggested," Holmes returned calmly. "Now, as to Hatherley. You describe him as a quiet, respectable man. Yet we have found in his room a fragment of a letter indicating that something must be done tonight. Does that accord with your view of his character?" Pencomb started. "A letter? What letter?" Holmes watched him closely. "You were not aware of it?" I know. Certainly not." "Then we must consider the possibility that your butler had concerns beyond the laying of tablecloths. Perhaps he was in communication with this dismissed secretary. Perhaps he had knowledge of these papers which made him of value or of danger." Pencomb rose abruptly and began to pace the room, much as Holmes himself had done earlier. "This is mere conjecture," he said. "You cannot seriously suggest that Hatherley was in league with a thief." "I suggest that he was involved in something which culminated last night," Holmes replied. "Whether as accomplice or victim remains to be determined." Pencomb stopped and faced him. "And you believe I know more of this than I have told you?" Holmes's gaze did not waver. "I am certain of it." There was a long silence. I could hear the faint ticking of a clock upon the mantel, and, from somewhere in the house, the distant murmur of voices. At last Pencomb spoke again, but his tone had altered. The defensive edge had given place to something nearer to resignation. "If I have withheld anything," said he slowly, "it is only because I did not believe it relevant." "That," said Holmes, "is precisely what I should like you to reconsider." Pencomb drew a deep breath. "Very well. There was an incident 2 nights ago." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Pray proceed." "I happened to be passing my aunt's study late in the evening," Pencomb continued, "when I heard voices within. The door was closed, but I recognized Miss Vane's tone, and another, lower, more urgent. I paused, thinking she might require assistance, but before I could knock, the door opened, and Hatherley came out." "You are certain it was Hatherley?" "Quite certain." "And your aunt?" "She remained within. When I entered, she appeared agitated, but she dismissed my inquiries. I thought little of it at the time." "And now?" "Now," said Pencomb, "I cannot but connect it with what has occurred." Holmes nodded slowly. "You did well to mention it, though somewhat late in the day." "I did not see its importance." "No," said Holmes softly. "That is the misfortune of many intelligent men. They see too much, and yet not the right thing." Pencomb made an impatient gesture. "What do you infer from it?" "That Hatherley was not merely a servant in your house," Holmes replied. "He had access to your aunt, and to matters which she would scarcely discuss with one of his station unless compelled." "Compelled? By what?" Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he crossed to the window and looked out into the fog-shrouded square. "By knowledge," said he at last, "or by possession of something she desired to conceal." He turned back abruptly. "You see now, Mr. Pencomb, why your account was incomplete. You presented us with the end of a chain, but omitted the links which preceded it. Yet those links are the very essence of the case." Pencomb sank into a chair, his face drawn. "What, then, is to be done?" Holmes took up his hat and gloves with a decisive movement. "What is always to be done?" said he. "We must find the missing link, and I have reason to believe it lies not in what was taken, but in what was left behind." He paused, and his keen eyes rested upon Pencomb once more. "And in the part which you have yet to play?" Pencomb looked up sharply at that, and for the first time there was something approaching fear in his expression. "My part?" he repeated. Holmes settled his hat upon his head with deliberate care, though his eyes never left the man's face. "Yes, You have, I think, been less a spectator in this affair than you would have us believe. But we shall not press that point prematurely. There is another person whose testimony we have yet to examine with sufficient care." "You mean Miss Elwood?" said I. Holmes inclined his head. "Precisely, Watson. A lady of admirable composure, placed in a household of disturbance, who yet betrays neither confusion nor excess of grief. Such self-command is always worthy of attention." Pencomb made a slight movement, as though to protest, but Holmes forestalled him. "Come," said he, "we shall not disturb your aunt further at present. If you will be so good as to request Miss Elwood's presence, I should be obliged." Pencomb rang the bell with a hand that was no longer entirely steady. When the servant appeared, the message was given, and within a few minutes Miss Elwood entered once more. She paused just inside the door, her dark eyes moving from Holmes to myself, and then to Pencomb, as though measuring the atmosphere of the room before committing herself to it. "You wished to see me, Mr. Holmes?" "I did," said he, with that gentle courtesy which he could assume at will. "Pray be seated." "I fear I must trouble you with a few further questions." She complied, folding her hands quietly in her lap. "You have been with Miss Vane for 3 years?" "I think." "A little over that time. And during that period, have you found her habits to be regular?" "Entirely so." "She retires early?" "Almost always." "And last night differed in no respect?" Miss Elwood hesitated, only for a fraction of a second, yet Holmes's quick eye noted it. "No," she said. "It did not differ." Holmes leaned slightly forward. "You are quite certain of that?" "I am." Holmes's expression remained unchanged, but I saw the faintest narrowing of his eyes. "You heard nothing until Miss Vane called out?" "Nothing." "No movement in the passage? No voices?" "None." Holmes rose and began to pace slowly before her. "You are aware, Miss Elwood," said he, "that the late Mr. Hatherley was in communication with someone outside the household?" Her gaze flickered, though she answered steadily enough. "I was not aware of it." "And yet you must have observed his habits. Did he receive letters?" "I cannot say. The post is not my concern." Holmes paused. "No, perhaps not. But you are a lady of observation. You would notice if a servant behaved in a manner unusual for his station." Miss Elwood's composure seemed to tighten, as though drawn inward. "He was reserved," she said. "That is all I can tell you." Holmes stopped directly before her. "Reserved," he repeated, "and yet bold enough to hold private conversations with your mistress behind closed doors." Her hands, which had lain still until now, clasped each other more tightly. "I know nothing of that." "Do you not?" Holmes's voice was very quiet. "Mr. Pencomb has just informed us that such a conversation took place 2 nights ago." At this, Miss Elwood's eyes turned involuntarily toward Pencomb, and in that single glance there was a fleeting expression, whether of surprise, reproach, or something more complex, I could not say. It vanished almost at once. "I was not present," she said. "No, but you were in the house." "Yes." "And you heard nothing?" "Nothing." Holmes regarded her for a long moment, then inclined his head slightly. "I thank you, Miss Elwood. You have been most helpful." She rose at once, and with a brief inclination to us all, withdrew from the room. The instant the door closed behind her, Holmes turned sharply to Pencomb. "You observe?" "I observe nothing," said he with some irritation. "She answered your questions plainly enough." "Plainly, yes," said Holmes, "but not quite truthfully." Pencomb stared. "You accuse her?" "I accuse no one," Holmes returned. "I merely note that she lied." "Upon what grounds?" "Upon the simplest of all," said Holmes. "She denied hearing any movement or voices last night, yet the arrangement of the study, as we have seen it, could not have been effected in silence. Drawers forced, papers scattered, a struggle, however brief, must have produced sound, and yet she heard nothing. Then she may have been asleep." "Possibly, but her room lies directly above the study. I have already ascertained as much. A light sleeper, such as she appears to be, would not fail to notice disturbance below. Pencomb sank back, his brow furrowed. "What does it mean?" "It means," said Holmes, "that Miss Elwood knows more than she is willing to say." He moved once more to the window, gazing out into the fog, which had begun to lift in faint, ragged wisps. "And now," he continued, half to himself, "we have 3 persons connected by knowledge of the same matter, Miss Vane, Hatherley, and Miss Elwood. A 4th, Mr. Kett, has shown interest in it, and you, Mr. Pencomb, stand somewhere between them all." He turned suddenly, his eyes bright with that cold light which I had learned to associate with the nearing of a solution. "The question is not who killed Hatherley," said he. "That is but the final act. The question is, what did he know, and why was it necessary that he should die for it?" Pencomb made a helpless gesture. "You speak as though the answer were already within your grasp." Holmes smiled faintly. "Not within my grasp," said he, "but within my reach. And I think, Watson, that the next step will bring it closer still." "What step is that?" Holmes took his coat from the chair and drew it on. "We shall pay a visit," said he, "to a gentleman who is no longer in this house, but whose shadow lies very plainly across it." "You refer to Kett," said I, as we took our leave of Blackfriars Square and once more found ourselves in the damp, greying streets. Holmes drew his coat closer about him as we stepped into a passing hansom. "I do," said he, "though whether we shall find the man himself or merely the impression he has left behind remains to be seen." "You believe he is still in London?" "I believe," Holmes replied, "that a man who meddles in matters of such delicacy does not withdraw himself entirely from the scene of his interest, unless compelled." "And you think he has not been compelled?" Holmes gave a slight smile. "If he had been, we should not now be discussing him." The cab rolled forward, bearing us westward through streets that were slowly re-emerging from the fog. The lamps burned less dimly now, and the forms of passers-by had regained their substance. Holmes remained silent for some time, his gaze fixed upon the shifting scene beyond the glass. At length he spoke again. "There is one point, Watson, which I should wish you to keep clearly in mind. The crime we investigate is not one of sudden passion or opportunistic violence. It is, rather, the conclusion of a process in which several persons have taken part, knowingly or otherwise. And Hatherley?" "Hatherley," said Holmes, "was either a participant who outlived his usefulness, or a witness who outlived his safety." "Then you incline to the latter?" Holmes tapped his fingers lightly upon the side of the cab. "I incline to neither yet, but I note that he had knowledge which others did not wish him to possess." "And the casket?" Holmes's eyes flickered briefly toward me. "A convenient object," said he. "Possibly even a genuine one. But I cannot rid myself of the impression that it serves another purpose, that of directing our attention." "To the theft, rather than the murder?" "Precisely." We soon reached a narrower and less reputable quarter, where the houses stood closer, and the air bore a faint odour of damp brick and neglect. Holmes rapped upon the roof, and the cab drew up before a modest lodging-house of somewhat dubious appearance. "This," said he as he descended, "is the last address at which Mr. Julian Kett was known to reside." We entered, and after some negotiation with a suspicious landlady, were shown to a small room upon the first floor. It was bare and ill-kept, with a narrow bed, a table, and a chair. The window looked out upon a cramped yard, where refuse had gathered in untidy heaps. "He left 3 days ago," said the woman. "Paid his account and went off with his things, said he was going out of town." "Did he mention where?" Holmes asked. "No, sir." "Had he visitors?" "None as I saw." Holmes nodded and slipped a coin into her hand. When she had gone, he closed the door and turned at once to the room. "He was here recently," said he. "Let us see what he has left behind." The search was brief, but not without result. In the drawer of the table, Holmes discovered a scrap of paper upon which was written a name and an address, nothing more. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes handed it to me. "B. Elwood," I read aloud, followed by the address of Blackfriars Square. "Precisely." "You think, I think," said Holmes, "that Mr. Kett's interest in Miss Vane's household was not confined to her." He moved to the window and examined the sill, then the floor beneath it. At last he straightened, a look of quiet satisfaction upon his face. "He left in haste," said he. "There are marks here, recent, and not yet obscured by dust. He packed quickly, and not all his belongings were taken with him." "Why the haste?" Holmes turned, his expression suddenly grave. "Because something occurred which made it unsafe for him to remain." "The murder?" "Possibly, or something connected with it." He glanced once more about the room, then took up his hat. "We have learned enough here for the moment. Come, Watson." As we descended the narrow stair, I could not but feel that the case, far from clarifying, had grown more complex with each step. "You believe Miss Elwood was in communication with this man?" I asked, as we regained the street. "I believe," said Holmes, "that there exists between them some link which has not yet been disclosed." "And that link connects to the papers?" "Undoubtedly." We walked in silence for a short distance. The fog had lifted almost entirely now, and the afternoon light, pale and cold, lay upon the streets. At last Holmes spoke again. "There is one course open to us," said he, "and it must be taken without delay." "What is that?" "We must return to Blackfriars Square." "Again?" "Yes, for there is one experiment which I should wish to make, and it can be made only upon the spot." "And what do you hope to prove?" Holmes's lips curved slightly. "Whether the lie which has been told us is merely perfect or perfectly constructed." When we reached the house once more, we found that Lestrade had returned and was in the study. He greeted us with a look of mingled curiosity and impatience. "Back again, Mr. Holmes? Have you discovered your man?" "I have discovered something more useful," said Holmes. "I have discovered a question." Lestrade frowned. "And what may that be?" Holmes stepped into the centre of the room and looked slowly about him, as though fixing every detail in his mind. "The question," said he quietly, "of whether this crime was committed by a man who entered this room or by one who never left it." Lestrade stared at him. "A man who never left it? That is nonsense. The window—" Holmes raised a hand lightly. "The window, yes, we have seen it. We have seen also the footprints beneath it, the marks upon the sill, the forced drawer, the scattered papers, all most obligingly placed before us. Let us now consider whether any one of them compels belief." Lestrade's expression hardened. "You mean to say the man did not come in that way?" "I mean to say," returned Holmes, "that if he did, he took an extraordinary pains to advertise the fact." He crossed at once to the window and threw it open wider. The damp air drifted in, carrying with it the faint odour of the garden soil. "Observe, Watson," said he, pointing to the sill. "These marks are indeed muddy, but they are not consistent. Here, one impression is deeper than the others, and here again, two overlap in a manner which suggests that they were made not in passage, but in repetition." "You think they were made deliberately?" I asked. "I think they were arranged," said Holmes. Lestrade gave a short exclamation. "Then the man came in by the door?" "Possibly," said Holmes. "Or he may not have come in at all in the sense you intend." He turned from the window and moved once more to the escritoire. "Let us consider the drawer," he continued. "It has been forced, so we are told, yet the key remains in the lock. Now, if I were a burglar in haste, would I waste time prizing open a drawer when the key lay ready to my hand?" Lestrade hesitated. He may not have seen it. Holmes smiled faintly. "A burglar who can locate a specific casket among a number of drawers, yet cannot perceive the key before his eyes, would be a singular being." He bent again and ran his fingers lightly over the scratches. "These marks," said he, "are superficial, They would scarcely suffice to force a well-made lock. They are, in fact, precisely what one would expect if the drawer had been opened first, and the marks added afterward. Lestrade flushed. Then the whole thing is a sham. Not the whole, said Holmes quietly. Only that portion of it which was designed to be seen. He turned suddenly toward the hearth. And now, said he, we come to a point of greater interest. He knelt and carefully brushed aside the faint scattering of ash which lay beyond the grate. From beneath it he extracted a small, charred fragment, which he held up between finger and thumb. You will recall, Watson, that we found signs of burning here. Yes. And you, Lestrade, suggested that papers had been destroyed. So I did. Holmes's eyes gleamed. And yet, said he, this fragment is not of paper. He handed it to me. I examined it closely. It is thicker, said I. Card, perhaps? Or something akin to it, said Holmes. But more significant still, observe the edge. It is not torn, but cut. And the burning has been incomplete, as though the process were interrupted. Lestrade leaned forward. What do you make of it? Holmes rose slowly. I make of it, said he, that something was destroyed here in haste, and that what was destroyed was not intended to be wholly lost, but merely rendered unrecognizable. Why should anyone wish that? I asked. To conceal its identity while preserving its substance, Holmes replied, or more simply, to remove one part of a thing and leave another. He placed the fragment carefully in his pocket. We shall return to that presently. For now, there is one final point which I wish to test. He moved to the centre of the room and stood where the body had lain. According to the evidence, he continued, Hatherley was struck down here near the hearth. There was no cry, no struggle of any consequence. The blow was swift and precise. Lestrade nodded. That is our conclusion. Very good. Now let us consider the circumstances under which such a blow could be delivered. Holmes glanced toward the door, then to the window, then back again. If the assailant entered by the window, he said, he must cross the room to reach this point. Hatherley, if he were here, must either have seen or heard him. Yet there is no sign of alarm, no overturned furniture, no defensive wound. He may have had his back turned, said Lestrade. Possibly, but then we must suppose that the assailant approached silently across a creaking floor, struck his blow with unerring accuracy, and departed again without disturbance, leaving behind him all these convenient traces. Holmes shook his head. It is too much to suppose. He turned suddenly toward the door. Now consider the alternative. Suppose the assailant was already in the room. Suppose he was known to Hatherley, and therefore admitted without suspicion. Lestrade's eyes narrowed. One of the household? Holmes did not answer directly. Such a person, he continued, would require no stealth in entering, no force in opening drawers, no haste in selecting what was to be taken. He would have time to arrange, to prepare, to construct the scene we now observe. A silence fell upon the room, heavy and oppressive. You mean, said Lestrade slowly, that the whole thing was done afterward? I mean, said Holmes, that the murder came first, and the burglary afterward. I felt a chill run through me. Then the footprints, the broken drawer, the open window, are all part of the same design, said Holmes. And the purpose? Holmes's expression grew grave. To direct suspicion away from the truth, and toward a lie so perfect that it would never be questioned. Lestrade drew a deep breath. And the truth? Holmes's gaze moved slowly about the room, as though seeking something which lay just beyond sight. The truth, said he quietly, is still here. It has not left this house. At that instant there came a sudden sound in the passage, a hurried step, followed by the abrupt opening of the door. The footman stood there, pale and breathless. Sir, he stammered, Miss Vane, she has fainted, and Miss Elwood, she cannot be found. Holmes was already at the door before the man had finished speaking. Show us at once, said he sharply. We followed the servant at speed through the dim passage and up the staircase, where the air seemed close and heavy with the suppressed agitation of the household. In a chamber at the front, we found Miss Vane reclining upon a couch, her face ashen and her breathing shallow. A maid stood wringing her hands beside her, while another hovered uncertainly with a glass of water. "Stand aside," said I, stepping forward. "I am a medical man." Holmes, meanwhile, cast a rapid glance about the room. "Where is Miss Elwood?" he demanded. "She was here but a moment ago, sir," said the maid. "When Miss Vane cried out, she ran to her, but when we turned again, she was gone." "Gone how?" said Holmes. "We do not know, sir. She must have left the room while we attended to Miss Vane." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Was the window open?" "No, sir." "The door?" "It stood as you see it." Holmes turned at once and strode into the passage, his movements quick and decisive. "Lestrade," he called, "you will see that no one leaves the house. Watson, remain here until you are satisfied as to Miss Vane's condition, then join me below." I bent my attention to the old lady, whose fainting fit, though alarming in appearance, yielded soon enough to simple measures. Within a few minutes she had revived sufficiently to speak, though in a feeble voice. "Miss Elwood, where is she?" she murmured. "We are endeavouring to discover that," said I gently. "You must not distress yourself." Her hand clutched at mine with surprising strength. "She must not go," she whispered. "She must not—" The effort overcame her, and she sank back once more, though not into unconsciousness. I saw that further questioning would be both useless and unkind, and leaving her in the care of the servants, I hastened from the room. Below I found Holmes and Lestrade in the hall, the latter issuing rapid instructions to the constable at the door. "The back garden?" I heard him say. "Already searched, sir. No sign." Holmes stood very still, his head slightly inclined, as though listening to something beyond the range of ordinary hearing. "Not the garden," said he quietly. "If she has gone, she has gone by the front." Lestrade turned. "Impossible. My man has been at the door the whole time." Holmes shook his head. "No one leaves a house unseen who does not wish to be seen," said he. "The question is not how she went, but why she went, at this moment, and in such haste." "You think she is the guilty party?" said Lestrade. "I think," Holmes replied, "that she has just realized the danger of remaining." He moved swiftly toward the study once more, and we followed close behind. Within, all remained as we had left it. The disordered papers, the open drawer, the faint scent of extinguished ash. Holmes crossed at once to the escritoire and began to examine the scattered documents with renewed attention. "What do you expect to find?" I asked. "What has been overlooked," said he. He sorted the papers rapidly, his long fingers moving with practiced ease. Suddenly he paused. "Here we are." He held up a sheet which at first glance appeared no different from the rest. Yet as I looked closer, I saw that one corner had been torn away. "The missing portion," said Holmes, "the counterpart to the fragment we found in Hatherley's room." "You mean—" Holmes fitted the torn edge of the paper to the charred fragment he had taken from the hearth. Though incomplete, the correspondence was unmistakable. "The same document," said he, "part preserved, part destroyed." "And what does it signify?" Holmes's eyes shone. "It signifies that Hatherley possessed a portion of this paper while the remainder was kept here. That alone is sufficient to establish a connection between him and the contents of this room." "But why should it be burned?" I asked. "Because it contained something which could not be allowed to fall into other hands," Holmes replied. "Something of value, not necessarily monetary, but of consequence." He turned to Lestrade. "You see now? The casket is a diversion. The true object of interest lay among these papers." Lestrade frowned. "Then why take the casket at all?" "To complete the illusion," said Holmes, "to give substance to the pretence of robbery." He laid the papers aside and stood for a moment in thought. "And now," he continued slowly, We must consider Miss Elwood's sudden disappearance in the light of this discovery. You think she has taken something? I said. I think, said Holmes, that she has taken precisely what she came for and what others have killed to obtain. Lestrade gave a sharp exclamation. Then we must pursue her at once. Holmes raised a hand. Not yet. Not yet? Lestrade repeated incredulously. No, for if we pursue her blindly, we shall lose both her and the object she carries. She has the advantage of knowledge of our suspicions and of the house. Then what do you propose? Holmes smiled faintly. We must let her go, said he, but not without knowing where she goes. Lestrade stared. And how do you propose to manage that? Holmes's gaze shifted toward the door, where the faint murmur of voices could be heard from the hall beyond. By trusting, said he, that she is not the only one who has been playing a part in this affair. He turned to me. Watson, you will accompany me. Lestrade, you will remain here and keep Mr. Pencombe under observation. I would not have him leave the house. You suspect him also? Said Lestrade. Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. I suspect, said he quietly, that we have not yet heard the whole truth from any of them. With that, he seized his coat once more and without another word strode from the room. I followed Holmes out into the street, where the last remnants of fog clung low along the pavement, trailing like torn veils in the chill afternoon air. He walked rapidly, his head slightly bowed, yet with that unmistakable air of purpose which admitted of no interruption. You know where she has gone? I asked, as I hastened to keep pace with him. I know where she must go, said he, which in such cases is nearly the same thing. You believe she intends to meet Kett? Holmes gave a short nod. If she is acting independently, she will seek him. If she is acting under instruction, she will still be drawn to the same point. In either case, we shall find our answer there. And where is that? Holmes turned briefly toward me, his eyes alight with that cold certainty which always heralded a decisive move. At the only place in London where both secrecy and urgency may be equally served, a place known to men who have something to exchange and something to fear. We had reached the main thoroughfare where traffic moved in slow, congested streams. Holmes raised his hand, hailed a cab, and gave a direction in a low voice. Temple District, said he as he stepped in, near the river. The journey was swift, and during it Holmes spoke little, though I observed that he drew from his pocket more than once the torn fragment of the letter, studying it with an intensity that seemed to exclude all else. At last the cab drew up in a narrow lane not far from the Thames, where the buildings leaned close and the light fell dimly between them. Holmes alighted at once. This will serve, said he. Come, Watson. We proceeded on foot through a winding passage, emerging at length into a small court, enclosed on three sides by tall, sombre houses whose windows were mostly shuttered. At one corner stood a modest doorway, above which hung a sign so weathered as to be scarcely legible. Holmes paused and glanced about him. She has not yet arrived, said he, but she will come. You are certain? As certain as one can be of anything which depends upon human motive, he replied. She has taken something of value, something for which others have already risked much. She cannot keep it. She must exchange it, and for that she requires a partner. And Kett, or someone in his place. We had scarcely taken up our position in the shadow of a recessed doorway when Holmes's hand closed suddenly upon my arm. Look, he whispered. At the far end of the court a figure had just entered, moving quickly and with evident caution. Even at that distance I recognized the slight form and dark attire of Miss Elwood. She has come, said Holmes. She paused for a moment, glancing behind her, then crossed swiftly to the door beneath the faded sign and knocked 3 times in quick succession. The door opened almost at once, and she slipped inside. Holmes waited only a few seconds before moving forward. "Come," said he quietly. "We must not lose her now." We reached the door and found it closed, but not locked. Holmes pushed it open and entered without hesitation. Within was a narrow passage, dimly lit, leading to a room at the rear. From that room came the murmur of voices. Holmes advanced silently, and I followed, my heart beating somewhat faster than usual. As we reached the threshold, the voices became distinct. "You were followed," said a man's voice, low and tense. "I was not," replied Miss Elwood. "I took every precaution." "You are certain?" "I tell you I am certain." Holmes stepped forward and pushed the door wide. "Your certainty," said he calmly, "is unfortunately misplaced." The two within started violently. Miss Elwood turned, her face paling, while the man beside her sprang to his feet. He was of middle height, with a thin, sharp face and restless eyes, features which matched well enough the description we had heard of the dismissed secretary. "Mr. Julian Kett, I presume," said Holmes. The man's gaze darted from Holmes to myself and back again. "You have no right to be here," he said sharply. "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "I have every right to be wherever the truth is to be found, and I think we shall find a good deal of it here." Miss Elwood had recovered some of her composure. "You have followed me," she said. "I have anticipated you," said Holmes. Kett gave a short, bitter laugh. "Then you know everything, I suppose?" Holmes's eyes rested upon him with quiet interest. "I know enough," said he, "to be aware that you and Miss Elwood have been engaged in a matter of some delicacy, and that the late Mr. Hatherley was also concerned in it." At the mention of the dead man's name, a shadow crossed Miss Elwood's face. "You have no proof," said Kett quickly. Holmes shrugged slightly. "Proof is a flexible commodity," said he. "But I have something better. Sequence. You were dismissed from Miss Vane's service after showing an interest in certain papers. You did not abandon that interest. Instead, you formed an alliance, perhaps with Miss Elwood, perhaps with Hatherley, perhaps with both." Kett's lips tightened, but he did not interrupt. "Something occurred," Holmes continued, "which altered the balance of that alliance. Hatherley came into possession of a portion of the document in question, enough to make him dangerous. Last night, he was killed. The remainder of the document was partially destroyed, and the scene arranged to resemble a burglary." Miss Elwood rose slowly to her feet. "You speak as though you were present," she said. Holmes inclined his head. "In a sense, I was. For the facts speak plainly enough, if one listens." He stepped forward, his gaze fixed now upon her. "The only question which remains," said he quietly, "is this. Which of you struck the blow?" For a few seconds after Holmes's question, there was absolute silence in the room. Miss Elwood stood motionless, her hands resting lightly upon the table before her, while Kett's sharp eyes flickered with calculation, like those of a man seeking some avenue of escape where none was visible. It was she who spoke first. "You are mistaken, Mr. Holmes," said she, though her voice, while steady, had lost something of its former composure. "You build your case upon assumptions." Holmes regarded her with a calm, almost sympathetic expression. "Upon deductions," said he, "which differ from assumptions in that they are based upon fact. Let us review them briefly." He turned slightly, as though addressing not only them, but myself as well. Hatherley was in possession of part of a document, one which, in its entirety, was held by Miss Vane. That document was of such a nature that it provoked inquiry from Mr. Kett and secrecy from its owner. You, Miss Elwood, stood between them, trusted by one, known to the other. Kett made an impatient movement. "This is all conjecture," he said. Holmes ignored him. "At some point," he continued, "an arrangement was made, whether by design or by gradual development, by which the contents of that document were to be obtained. Hatherley, by virtue of his position, had access, You, Miss Elwood, had influence, and Mr. Kett had motive. Miss Elwood's gaze dropped for a moment, then rose again. "Suppose it were so?" she said quietly. "What then?" "Then," said Holmes, "we must ask why the arrangement failed." Kett laughed harshly. "Because the fool bungled it, because he lost his nerve." "Ah," said Holmes softly. "He lost his nerve." Kett bit his lip, as though he had said too much, but Holmes pressed on without pause. "He had obtained his portion of the document," Holmes went on, "but something occurred. Perhaps he realized its full significance, perhaps he feared the consequences, and he refused to proceed further. He became a liability." Miss Elwood's hands tightened upon the edge of the table. "You speak very confidently," she said. "I speak," said Holmes. "From the evidence, the fragment found in his room proves that he possessed part of the paper. The corresponding fragment in the study proves that the remainder was there. The attempt to destroy it proves that someone feared its discovery, but lacked the time or resolution to complete the act." He stepped closer. "And the absence of any sign of struggle proves that Hatherley admitted his killer willingly." Kett's face had grown pale, but his eyes still darted restlessly. "You cannot prove who that killer was," he said. Holmes's gaze shifted between them. "On the contrary," said he, "I can prove who it was not." Neither spoke. "It was not an intruder," Holmes continued. "The evidence of the window is false. It was not a stranger, for Hatherley would not have admitted him without alarm. It was not Miss Vane, whose physical weakness makes such a blow improbable, and whose subsequent conduct, though curious, lacks the necessary intent." He paused, and in that pause the tension in the room seemed to tighten like a drawn wire. "That leaves," he said quietly, "only two persons." Miss Elwood drew a long breath. "And if I were to say it was he?" she said, indicating Kett. Kett started violently. "You dare?" Holmes raised a hand. "Before you accuse one another," said he, "permit me to complete the chain." He turned slightly toward Kett. "You were not in the house last night," said he. "Your absence is established, yet you expected something to occur. The note we found in Hatherley's room, it must be done tonight, was not written by him. The hand is different, hurried, and less practiced." "It was written by someone within the house." Miss Elwood's face went white. "You see?" cried Kett. "It was she. She wrote it. She urged him on." "And you," Holmes continued calmly, "waited for the result. You intended to receive what was obtained and to profit by it." Kett's mouth opened, then closed again. Holmes turned once more to Miss Elwood. "You, however," said he, "were placed in a position of increasing danger. Hatherley hesitated. He threatened, perhaps, to reveal what he knew. The document, or part of it, was in his possession. You could not allow that." Her composure broke at last. "You do not understand," she cried. "He would have ruined her, do you hear? Ruined her utterly." "Her?" said I involuntarily. Miss Elwood pressed her hands to her face, then let them fall again. "Miss Vane," she said in a low voice. "Those papers, if they had been made public, would have destroyed her. Not merely her reputation, her whole life." Holmes's expression softened slightly. "And so," said he, "you acted to prevent it." "I tried to reason with him," she went on, her voice trembling now. "I begged him to give me the paper, to trust me. But he would not. He had grown frightened, suspicious. He said he would go to the police." "And you struck him," said Holmes quietly. She closed her eyes. "Yes." The single word seemed to fall into the room like a stone into still water. Kett gave a hoarse laugh. "You see," he said. "You see what she has done? And she would have left me to bear it." "You would have sold it," she said bitterly. "You would have destroyed her for your own gain." Holmes raised his hand once more. "The moral distinctions between you," said he, "are of less importance than the facts. Miss Elwood, you killed Hatherley to prevent him from exposing the contents of that document. You then attempted to destroy the remainder, but were interrupted, perhaps by Miss Vane's dissent, and were forced to abandon the effort. The scene was then arranged to resemble a burglary in order to divert suspicion. She bowed her head. Yes. And the casket? I took it to make the story complete. Holmes nodded slowly. And this morning, realizing that the truth might yet be discovered, you sought to recover what remained and to secure your own safety. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a strange mixture of defiance and despair. I would have done it again, she said. For her. Holmes regarded her for a long moment. I do not doubt it, said he quietly. At that instant, there came the sound of hurried steps upon the passage, and the door was flung open. Lestrade stood there, breathless, with 2 constables behind him. I thought as much, he cried. Mr. Holmes, you were right. We traced them here. He stopped short as he took in the scene. Holmes turned toward him. You are in time, Lestrade, said he. The case is complete. Lestrade stood for a moment in the doorway, his keen eyes passing from Miss Elwood to Kett, and finally resting upon Holmes with a look in which satisfaction struggled with reluctant admiration. Well, said he at last, it seems you have saved me some trouble. Holmes inclined his head slightly. The essential facts are before you, said he. The confession, I think, leaves little room for doubt. Lestrade stepped forward, and the constables moved to either side of Miss Elwood. She did not resist. Indeed, there was about her now a curious stillness, as though the strain of concealment having been lifted, she had resigned herself entirely to what must follow. You understand what this means? Said Lestrade not unkindly. I understand, she replied. Kett, however, had not relinquished his agitation. And what of me? He demanded. You have no charge against me. I did nothing. Holmes turned his gaze upon him. You did not strike the blow, said he, but you were party to the design which led to it. Your interest in the document, your communication with both Miss Elwood and Hatherley, and your presence here to receive the result. All these will bear examination. Kett's expression hardened, but he said no more as the constables moved closer. Holmes, having thus placed the matter in Lestrade's hands, drew me quietly aside. There remains, said he in a low voice, one final thread to be tied. You refer to Miss Vane? Precisely. We returned at once to Blackfriars Square, where the house still bore the subdued air of a place overshadowed by calamity. Miss Vane had been removed to her chamber, and it was there that Holmes requested to see her. She received us reclining upon her couch, her face pale but composed. There was in her expression now a certain gravity which suggested that she understood more than had yet been spoken aloud. You have come to tell me, said she before Holmes could speak, that it is over. Holmes bowed. It is over, said he. The truth has been established. She closed her eyes for a moment. And Miss Elwood? She has confessed. A faint tremor passed over the old lady's features, but she did not speak. Holmes continued gently. It is not my habit to intrude upon private matters, madam, but in this case the motive lies so close to the act that it cannot be wholly separated from it. The papers which you guarded so carefully, may I ask whether their nature justified the fear which surrounded them? Miss Vane opened her eyes and looked steadily at him. They did, she said. They concerned a matter long past, one which, if revived, would have brought disgrace upon a name already too often exposed to public scrutiny. And Miss Elwood was aware of this? She was the only one in whom I confided. I trusted her absolutely. Holmes inclined his head. And she justified that trust, though in a manner you could scarcely have intended. Miss Vane's lips trembled. She was devoted to me, she said. Too devoted, perhaps. Holmes did not reply at once. At length he said, The law will take its course, yet there are circumstances in this case which may not be without weight. Miss Vane's gaze rested upon him with a look of quiet understanding. "You will do what you can," she said. Holmes bowed again, and with that, the interview was at an end. It was some days later, when the affair had passed into the hands of the authorities and the public interest had begun to wane, that I ventured to discuss it with Holmes in our Baker Street rooms. "You have solved the case with your usual precision," said I, "yet I cannot but feel that there remains something which you have not fully expressed." Holmes, who was seated at the window with his violin across his knee, glanced at me with a faint smile. "My dear Watson," said he, "you perceive more than you suppose." "You mean that Pencomb was not so innocent as he appeared," Holmes completed. "You suspected him from the first." "I suspected that he knew more than he chose to tell. His visit to the church, his hesitation regarding Kett, his awareness of the papers, all pointed to a man who stood closer to the centre of the affair than he admitted. And yet he was not directly involved. Not in the act itself, but he had observed enough to understand the danger and chose to remain silent until events forced his hand. I considered this. "Then the lie," said I slowly, "was not merely the arrangement of the scene, but the conduct of those within it." Holmes laid his violin aside. "Exactly. It was a lie constructed not of falsehoods, but of truths so carefully arranged that they formed a misleading whole. Each person told part of the truth, Miss Vane from confusion, Pencomb from caution, Miss Elwood from necessity. Only by separating those truths and examining them individually could the pattern be discerned." "And that," said I, "was the lie too perfect to notice." Holmes's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. "You have it, Watson." He rose and moved toward the mantel, where the remains of his morning correspondence lay scattered. "The most dangerous deceptions," he continued, "are those which require no invention. They rely instead upon selection, upon presenting what is true and concealing what is essential. It is a method as old as human nature and as effective as ever." "And Miss Elwood?" I asked. Holmes paused. "She will face the consequences of her act," said he, "yet I cannot regard her without a certain measure of sympathy." "She acted from loyalty, misguided but genuine." "And Kett? A man of lesser fibre," Holmes replied. "Ambition without scruple, and intellect without restraint. He will not fare so well." I nodded, and for a time we sat in silence, each occupied with his own reflections. At last Holmes took up his violin once more and drew the bow lightly across the strings, producing a soft, melancholy strain which seemed to echo the subdued tragedy of the case. "The world, Watson," said he as he played, "is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observes." And with that characteristic remark, he allowed the matter to pass from his mind, turning his thoughts, as ever, to the next problem which might challenge his singular and extraordinary powers.